All right, psychological disorders. I usually ask by way of clicker, and I might still, about how much we are impacted by psychological disorders and how. So let's do that. Take out your clickers. Let's go ahead and use a way, and I want to show a couple of things. And just simply ask a couple of questions about your interactions and your comfortable level or your comfortableness with the topic of psychological disorders. And in this case, what we're looking for and finding is that we vary a lot as to how comfortable we are interacting with people with psychological disorders. And so in this case, let's see, it'll just be a couple of quick questions and we'll just the discussion this way. So first question, and you don't have to overthink this, it's have you ever had an encounter with a person with a mental disorder while in public? Have you ever had an encounter with a person with a mental disorder while in public? Let's say at the mall or supermarket or Disneyland or wherever you're at. Someone with a psychological or mental disorder, and you, have you had an encounter? The notion and the question ultimately asks us this: how common and why are there so many? How many wonder about how prevalent psychological disorders are, and what are your odds of running into somebody with a known psychological disorder? Because that ultimately leads to this question: how many people really are struggling with that? And do they just simply function mostly in society, go to places like malls and supermarkets and show up? And then if that is a lot of people, how do we respond? Is there something, and we'll talk about that. What are ways that we should encounter or deal with people who maybe are struggling and maybe are having, issues right there that may be influencing how we view and see things and how they view and see things. So in this, out of, let's say, 300 respondents, about 280 said, yes, you have had an encounter with somebody. And then I guess the next question, in that encounter, for the vast majority of you, 90%, the question comes in, what feelings came about? Anybody want to describe a situation in which you had an encounter recently in a public place with someone with a mental disorder? And how did you know they had a mental disorder, and what did you feel and why? But do you want to explain or describe a recent situation and dealing with somebody who you knew was struggling? Anybody? Yeah. So it can be a little bit awkward. So a little bit more than half of you are saying, yeah, it makes you feel uncomfortable. And the uncomfortable part maybe is what? What's the uncomfortable part? I'm not sure what's going to happen. There's an uncertainty.
Not knowing why it's like that.
Yeah, maybe there's this whole question about why is it like that? So the unpredictable, well, let's go. My guess is a lot of this has to do with unpredictability. So I'll just go to the next one and ask, did it have anything to do with did you feel at risk in any way? I mean, that's part of it, right? Anybody else? A situation and you're wondering, is this dangerous for me? Should we approach somebody that's dealing with an issue like this?
Yeah, my cousin got diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she can just go from someone very pleasant, very calm,
Okay.
next moment lash out.
So a cousin diagnosed with schizophrenia whose behavior is not only unpredictable, but can sometimes be a little bit dangerous, and so it's hard to be sure if you're safe or not. Would that be right? This is always an interesting one for me because we'll talk a lot about does psychological disability more dangerous? What do you think? And maybe some of us, we say it depends. I think the problem for a lot of people, however, is the opposite. Not the opposite of are they dangerous or not dangerous, but the assumption is that too oftentimes we see people who are identified as psychologically disordered or dealing with something like schizophrenia, and then we hear that they've done something really wrong, bad, harmful to other people, when in reality, anybody that is diagnosed with one of these psychological disorders is probably no more dangerous because they have the disorder than they were before the disorder. There's a little bit more unpredictability, but having a disorder doesn't make somebody dangerous. And that's a very interesting switch that I guess I want to talk some about and mention that, because there are people in this room who have family members who struggle with disorders, and many of them would attest that just because a person has this disorder, they're not any different. They're a little bit odd and maybe a little unpredictable. It doesn't make them, quote, dangerous. And I think we have to really come to kind of a quick determination sometimes, and our tendency is to think, I don't want to mess with that person. They seem a little bit worrisome to me, and I don't know what to do, and I'm afraid for me or the people I'm with, and so we fall in that category. And I think in reality, we find for many people with a psychological disorder, they're not any more dangerous than they were before they had the disorder. They're not any more dangerous, and probably are dealing more with some internal things that make them even maybe less dangerous at times. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how that works. So are there any members you can see here? Half the class say they have a member that suffers from some sort of anxiety disorders. How about anybody in here that might have a family member that suffers from schizophrenia? And predict it ahead of time. What numbers do you think are going to show up in here? How likelihood will somebody in this room, what percentage, just guess as you kind of click in your answer, how many percentage of people in here might know somebody or have a family member that suffers from schizophrenia? Ultimately, well, we'll talk some about numbers, because schizophrenia is a very devastating disorder, and it hits a lot of people. Anybody know the number of people affected by schizophrenia as a general rule? What number of people, what's your odds of developing schizophrenia? That's another way of saying it. Out of 100, what are your odds of developing schizophrenia? What do you think? Out of 100 people, how many schizophrenics will we find in that group? Well, we'll talk about that. You'll see in this classroom, somewhere in the neighborhood, I don't know how to do this quick of math, but my guess is it's about 14% of people. Would that be right? Somewhere in that neighborhood? 28, somewhere around there. And so we have at least 28 people in this room who have a family member who deals with schizophrenia. By the way, the odds of having schizophrenia are 1 in 100. Those are your odds, 1 in 100. That's pretty much worldwide we find that, and so we really want to start talking about where does this come from and what does it mean. By the way, depression is going to be a little bit more common, and so you can guess here, if we stop this at somewhere in 100 people, we're going to find depression probably in as high as maybe 20% of the people in this room, maybe even higher. Will know somebody. So it's closer to maybe even 40 something percent. Well, actually it's more than that. It's more than 50%. So what I want to do then is to say, let's recognize this is pretty prevalent, and we've got to figure it out. I want to spend some time exploring what is a psychological disorder. What does it mean? How prevalent are they? And then how should we prepare and be ready to interact with people that we come in contact with, sometimes on a weekly basis, that may be dealing with a psychological disorder? And then if a family member comes to us, or a roommate or a friend, and says, I think I'm anxious, I think I'm getting depressed, what's our response? How do we handle that? And it will be a very real and personal question for many of you. By the way, the percentage of people who report a mental disorder in their lifetime is about 50%. The percent of people in their lifetime that report having a mental disorder is about 50%. Some of those are substance use disorders. a good percentage. Anxiety disorders, you can see, are pretty high. Mood disorders, 1 in 5 people. And then schizophrenia, that's supposedly about 1 in 100 right there. So the category that we call these disorders, the anxieties and substance abuse and mood disorders, and the percent of the population that meet the criteria at any given time, pretty high. So 32% at any given time might be meeting a criteria for a disorder. And I'll talk a little bit about those criteria. What does it mean then? And why is it happening that we see more and more on the streets? One of the reasons, by the way, is we no longer, when your parents, most of y'all's parents were young, something was changing. And it was the way we handled people with psychological disorders. What was changing was that we used to be able, probably in your grandparents' generation, it was pretty common that they would put people in state or county mental hospitals if they thought the person was suffering from a disorder. And they could hold them in a state hospital for a long time. In fact, until that person showed progress or demonstrated that they were, quote, sane, you could literally have somebody locked up and put into a mental hospital for as long as they were showing signs of mental illness. And what happened was, in the 60s and 70s, there was a change. And they said, no longer can we keep people in an institution without their approval. In other words, if you just simply, at the time, were concerned about a family member, they could lock them up. But today, you're unable to do that. You would have to have a whole lot of other criteria happen before you could lock somebody up against their will. So, yeah, question. It's a national law now, and there's a way, some states deal with it slightly differently. And so it does vary state to state in some of their laws, but for the most part, you follow this very general principle, right? And that is, I cannot be locked up against my will, even if I'm suffering from a psychological disorder. So if I go in there and I'm clearly schizophrenic, but I say, I don't want to be here, I want to be free, and I'm not a danger to myself or anybody else, you basically can't keep me in there. So it's very interesting how that has now led to more and more people out on the streets, and so we'll talk about that. So, how do we define, anybody want to try that? What makes somebody disordered? It's a hard question. How would you define somebody that's psychologically disordered? What would we call it? Let me start with this example. I'm lecturing at where I was an instructor at Colorado State. And I was a class similar to this one. And there were about, 200-300 people in the room. And I was teaching the class. And every Tuesday, Thursday, at the same time throughout those days, there was a kid who would come walking by on the outside. These would be outside, doors leading to the outside. And in this lecture hall, he'd come walking by almost every lecture. And you knew he was coming by because he was singing songs very loudly in Spanish. He was wearing headphones, carrying a Walkman. I don't know if you know what those are. And he's carrying a Walkman, and he was wearing a sombrero, collecting cans in all the trash cans outside. This isn't him. But it's a disorder for a guy to wear a sombrero and sing songs in Spanish very loudly while collecting cans. Is that psychologically disordered? What do you think? Why would you say it's not disordered? He's just doing it. What criteria would you want to find out? Well, first of all, was it a little bit odd? Yeah, there weren't a lot of people in this culture at this time at that place that wore sombreros. There weren't a lot of people that sang out loud. And there weren't a lot of people that just kind of could care less what anybody thought, and that was him. He didn't care. So the question comes in, when does odd behavior become psychologically disordered? I told you of 2 students that I knew at Biola. One works here now. As a student, I never saw either of them, did I tell you? I never saw either of them wear shoes. Ever. No, they never wore shoes to class. They never wore shoes anywhere. Is that psychologically disordered? doesn't seem like it. In other words, can people do odd things and not be disordered? Yeah. So we have to figure out, here's the question, how do you define it? I don't think that's abnormal. But some people might go, but that's weird. There's got to be some sort of weird criteria. You can't just go around acting weird. That's got to be, at some point, it's a disorder. At what point does it become disordered? Who wants to define that? There's the problem. You see, you try and draw a line between normal and abnormal. Where does the light grain become dark grain? Someone draw that line for me, and culture say, I know this is a disorder. This is a mental illness, and that's not. Well, guess what? We have ways of trying to distinguish the light green from the dark green, and we can draw lines, but you have to ask about 4 or 5 questions. What would you want to find out about a person, or what would you want to know about their behavior, or what would you want to know if it fits this criteria? Well, it goes like this. Here's the first one. Ready? Is this atypical? So so let's start with the person that never wore shoes ever. They just never. I don't even know if they own shoes. By the way, I saw this person on campus, and I asked him, and I said, "Hey, you're wearing shoes?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm at work now. I graduated, and they make me, so to speak, wear shoes to work." That's interesting. Now, is that atypical to never wear shoes in this culture, in this place, in this culture? Is it atypical not to wear shoes? To wear a sombrero, is it atypical? We call that statistically deviant. That means it's atypical. They fall outside normal statistical ranges of what we call normal behavior. And so abnormal starts with there's a little bit of statistical deviance there. It's not what we call normal. She's a statistical deviant. No one has ever scored higher on an IQ test, did I tell you this story? Than her, Marilyn Vos-Savant. No one has ever scored higher. I told you she beat me by like 1 point. It was a very disappointing day for me. You don't believe that, do you? No. Marilyn Vos-Savant, no one's ever scored higher on an IQ test than her. She has a column called Ask Marilyn, is she a statistical deviant? Statistically, if you know what we're talking about with the bell curve, she's like way over here. Way over there. She's a deviant. Is she abnormal? Yeah, I don't know her. She's not. But we have to then add more what we call criteria by which to be able to judge something as being abnormal or not. And another one our culture uses is, does it violate some standard? Is it unjustifiable? Does she violate any cultural standards? I think her whole career is about violating cultural standards. That's how she defines herself as Lady Gaga. I'm going to violate all the cultural standards that I can about anything. Is she abnormal? So, many of you say yes. Really? Now I know some of we're just jesting, but is she really psychologically abnormal? And the question is, well, you got to ask more questions. She's probably a deviant in many respects statistically in some categories, like Marilyn Vos-Savant was, or the person that wears a sombrero, or the person that doesn't wear shoes. But here's the problem. That violates what we say and do, but that's our cultural standards. Cultural standards change all the time. If we just use these 2 things, then we would lock her away. Does a behavior is she feeling any emotional distress by her behavior? I mean, you probably don't know her personally, but if you did, you could ask her, I don't know, Lady Gaga, do you ever feel distress at violating cultural standards? Do you feel like, I can't stop, I really wished I could, I feel bad? I think the answer would be, no, I don't think she feels bad at all. I think she probably likes the attention, she probably likes the money, she probably likes to set standards. I don't know. But she's probably not emotionally distressed. So she would not qualify according to this. She's statistically deviant in many ways, just like the person with no shoes. She probably violates cultural standards, but I don't think it's undesirable for her. People, by the way, when they follow in this criteria, they're going, I feel sadder than anybody around me or I've ever felt before, and I don't want to get out of bed, and I don't like that feeling. That's the emotional distress. This is not something I desire or want. I want it away from me. That's what I mean by emotional distress. It becomes, another criteria is this maladaptive. This does not help people. The guy with the sombrero, by the way, if you talk to him, he was just as pleasant as can be. He just enjoyed life. It was a simple life for him in many respects, but it wasn't I guess it could be maladaptive. Maybe I don't know. He seemed to function and adapt pretty well. So now we start to figure out, okay, abnormal has got to be not atypical, unjustifiable, undesirable, maladaptive. And when it meets all of these criteria, you could even add in now a kind of a gauge to go, you know what, if you put all of these up there and they equal or move over to abnormal, then you start to go, well, that's a little bit more normal, this is a little bit more abnormal, and the dark green becomes a little bit different than the light green. The problem is drawing that line is really hard. So we have criteria that people have set up and we put it down in a book that helps psychologists go, let me look at the criteria and see. If you tell me you've been sad for 2 or 3 days, I might go, well, that's fine. 2 to 3 days, that's nothing. How long could you be sad and not want to get out of bed before someone says that meets the criteria for being depressed? How long can you be sad, not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to interact, and not do anything? How long before a psychologist can find, or a clinician can look up in his little book of criteria and say, you've been sad for that long, that many days, that falls within the category of being psychologically depressed. But you know how long that is? Is it 3 days? 4 days? It's 2 weeks. 2 weeks. But there's other criteria. Just because you're sad for 2 weeks doesn't necessarily make you depressed. Some of you say, I've been this way for a long time. So there's other criteria. So there has to be other ways of explaining and categories, and I'll show you some of those. Okay, so that's psychologically some of the ways in which we define abnormality. Does that make sense? What is the legal word? What does the legal profession do for people when they come in and they want to say, the legal world, remember, if you get arrested for something and the legal word that they use for a person is sanity or insanity. That is a word that is primarily kind of related to this word called impairment or impaired judgment. If you can't control yourself because of impaired judgment, they might legally call you insane. And that's the whole basis of insanity defenses for people that have been accused of certain crimes. What they're going to say is, I didn't have any self-control. I wasn't able to control myself. This therefore led to impaired judgment, and you can't hold me guilty for this crime if I'm insane. That's what we do, by the way, with insanity defense. People can't be held guilty for a crime if they commit it while in a state of impaired self-control, in a state of insanity. That's called the insanity defense. How many of y'all from San Francisco and you've ever been to the Moscone Center, your big area called the Moscone Center, and you know why it's called? It's named after a guy named George Moscone, and you know what happened to George Moscone? Was one of your, I think it was the mayor at the time. Anybody know what happened to Mayor George Moscone in the late 1970s? Guy named Dan White, what he did? Dan White got fired as a city supervisor. He went home, got a gun, came back, climbed through a window to avoid the metal detectors, went up to George Moscone, the mayor, and bam, 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 shot and killed him. Went down the hall and shot another guy named Harvey Milk. Name sound familiar? Harvey Milk shot him because he was at the time, a proponent of homosexuality, and Dan White just didn't like him at all. They just fought a lot. So he killed the mayor, killed Harvey Milk. There was a movie made about that. Well, Dan White went to trial. There was no doubt he shot the guys, and no doubt he killed them, but he had a very interesting defense. He pleaded insanity and said he wasn't sane, and the jury bought it. and said he wasn't guilty of murder, he was guilty of manslaughter, which is less of a crime. And basically the idea is if you do claim insanity defense and you get out, you get called insane and therefore not held responsible, then you can go to jail only for how long? Until you're declared what? Till you're declared sane. That was Dan White. Oh, by the way, what was the main argument his lawyers used to show he was insane? They showed what the only food he ate over a 3-month period was what? He ate one food in 3 months. Twinkies. They pretty much demonstrated that's the only food he ate in that amount of time. I think it was like I don't know if it's 3 months or 6 weeks, something like that. And his defense argued sufficiently according to the jurors, that wow, anybody that eats Twinkies for 6 months straight or 6 weeks or however long is definitely insane. They called it the Twinkie defense, by the way. He got out. Killed himself the moment he got out of jail, by the way, out of prison. He served 3, 4, 5 years, I don't remember, committed suicide. Was definitely dealing with abnormal and mental disorders. But remember, my whole point is this. The legal profession uses that criteria of insanity, the psychological world, and they'll bring in psychologists to help determine insanity or not, but they tend to look at what's a disorder and what's not. So, as I mentioned, we classify disorders using the DSM-4 and now the new DSM that just came out recently. It's called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and basically what it does is help people kind of name and describe certain disorders. It helps kind of put a label to a disorder, and it shows the criteria, but it's controversial because now we're calling people or labeling them. And some people have a label now on that follows them for a long time, and in this culture, having a label like depressed or schizophrenic could be pretty negative, and it does have an impact on people, but that's ways in which psychologists use to help diagnose psychological disorders. All right, questions so far? Anything? Yep.
When did homosexuality get removed from the list of recognized psychological disorders?
I think homosexuality was listed in the DSM-3, which probably was back in, I think it was updated in the early 1980s, in which it was taken out as a category as a psychological disorder. Probably in the 80s, but you know what? Don't quote me on that. I think that's when it was. Somewhere in the 70s or 80s, it was taken out of as a diagnosable psychological disorder. So you can see here, there are lots of things that are, the controversy is there are some things that are just culturally odd or weird at times, that aren't normal or appropriate according to some cultures, and they make it into this book. And then later on, people go, well, why was that ever in there? And sometimes they think, we got to put something else in there. So it kind of does have, there certainly isn't like, this perfect gold standard, unfortunately. Is that, yeah, good question. Yeah?
How dependent is the DSM on cultural norms?
Well, DSM's, this is a tough one. By the way, to move from the next version, DSM, the IV stands for version 4. It's now the next version, version 5, that just came out this year. It was a 10-year process. So they're looking at things like culture and why some things should be included and how you label things and not. It was a very challenging, and you bring in experts from all across the spectrum who have very different opinions about things, whether or not they're disordered or not.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.